Afternoon. It's good to see everybody here. And we'll be picking up in our study in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 2. If you want to turn to Genesis chapter 2, I think it'll be helpful to follow along. And we'll be picking up in verse 16. So far we've seen the creation of really the whole cosmos, the whole universe. And then also we've seen God more specifically working on the earth and creating the earth with the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all those things. And that was primarily in chapter 1. And then as we got into chapter 2, we saw that the scope kind of funneled down into speaking about really the creation of man. And that becomes the focus of chapter 2, and really we could say for the rest of the Bible. And God created man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and then he also placed man in the garden. Probably more accurately could be translated in the grove, which was really like a grove of trees. And we're going to find that in this garden, even though it was supplied everything that this man needed, it did have one thing in the garden that was forbidden from him. Everything else was accessible to him. He had dominion over the birds of the air, the fish in the sea, over all the cattle and creeping things on the ground. But there was this one thing that was forbidden. There's this one thing that was withheld from him that we'll read about this afternoon. It says in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 16 and 17, "The Lord God commanded the man, saying, 'From any tree of the garden you may eat freely. But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die.'" All right, so this is a prohibition, if you will, from the Lord, prohibiting him from being able to partake of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Maybe sometimes as we're reading through the book of Genesis, or we're just reading about this in general, when we think of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, maybe we think of this really bad tree. If you're just taking it literally, maybe you think this tree of the knowledge of good and evil has some type of poison in it or something, and if they eat it, they'll die. Or you may think that there's just something inherently wrong about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you might think that's why God is keeping them from eating of this tree. But we have to be very careful, because we already read in chapter 1 and verse 31 that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. All would include also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so there's nothing inherently wrong about this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As a matter of fact, if we think about it, if we just take it strictly by the name or the title that's given to it, we could say that really, isn't that what God possesses? God possesses the knowledge of good and evil. And of course, there's nothing wrong with God having the knowledge of good and evil. As a matter of fact, it would be very bad if we were to try to serve a God who didn't know the difference between good and evil. And many of the ancients did serve gods that they had created in their own image that seemed to not know the difference between these things. But our God is unique in that he is a moral God. He is a holy God, and he's a God that truly does know right from wrong. He has a knowledge of good and evil. So that in and of itself isn't bad. There's nothing inherently wrong with this tree. It's created good. It's a part of God's good creation. But still, for some reason, God prohibited Adam from eating of this tree. Or maybe we think, maybe there's something wrong with Adam. Maybe there's something wrong with him in the way that he was created, that God would forbid him from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that would be partially true, as we'll talk about in a moment. But there's really nothing inherently wrong with Adam himself. Again, he's part of God's good creation, created in a way, just the way that God had wanted him to. As a matter of fact, after he created man and woman, he said, it is very good. And so he was very pleased with his creation of mankind. So there's nothing inherently wrong with Adam. Adam is good. The tree is good. Why is God not allowing this person who's created in a very good way from eating this tree that's made in a very good way. Well, the problem is that you have two good things. They're just not good mixed together. And maybe you have some things laying around in your house that are good by themselves. In and of themselves, you might be able to, store them away and they'll be safe. But as soon as you perhaps mix these two different chemicals together or whatever it might be, then all of a sudden you got something deadly. And that's what we seem to have going on here with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Nothing wrong with Adam, nothing wrong with the tree. What's wrong is when those two mix together. That's when death will occur. That's when the situation becomes deadly and poisonous. You say, well, why is that the case? Well, if you think about it, God created man from dust, just as he created all the rest of the animals from the ground. And we're all physical beings made of flesh. Of course, human flesh is a little bit different than animal flesh, as 1 Corinthians chapter 15 would say. But we're still flesh. We're physical beings living in a physical environment on a physical earth. And as such, there are some certain physical laws that we live by as we're living in this world. We have certain innate tendencies that are in us that help us to survive. Animals have it, we have it, we just all have this, within our very flesh. And basically it boils down to three things. To survive on this world, you need basically three things innate within you, these natural tendencies: self-preservation, self-gratification, and then also self-promotion. In other words, you got to look out for number one if you're going to survive in this world. You need to have self-preservation. This is common with all animals, generally speaking. Animals want to preserve their lives. They don't want to die, just like we don't want to die. You get an animal in some type of dangerous situation, adrenaline's going to be pumping, their heart's going to be pumping, they're going to get into this fight or flight mode, and they're going to want to preserve their lives. And the same thing is true with us as humans. In our physical bodies, it's very innate within us to survive. It's ingrained in us to survive, to preserve our lives. That's just a part of what it means to be living on this world. And that's very helpful if your main purpose in life is to survive this world. Self-gratification is very helpful for animals and to a certain extent helpful to humans as well. The desire to want to eat and gratify and satisfy your hunger. And not only eat, but eat good foods and foods that are tasty and things like that. Sexual desire falls under this umbrella. Desire to be gratified sexually, that helps with the procreation and with the multiplication that God had told the animals and the humans to have, where they can flourish on the earth and fill up the earth as he wanted it to. If you're just looking at it from a survival standpoint, self-gratification is a good thing. Same thing with self-promotion. You see this especially with pack animals, and certain animals like that, where you have the alpha male. It's always good to promote yourself among the pack, because then you get the best of the food. You got access to the other female animals. And that's good, because then the stronger animals procreate and have animals or offspring that are strong, and the species can be very strong because of that. That's a very helpful thing, this whole hierarchy even within the animal kingdom. And that's good for humans as well. It's good for us to have that innate sense within us as we're trying to survive in the world. There's nothing wrong with the animal instincts that we have, because mankind is placed in an environment where survival is very important and very needful. And so, again, these are things that are innate within man. So you have a tree that's good, that has certain qualities. It has the knowledge of good and evil. But then you have a man who's created with these innate survival instincts, we could say, within him. When you mix these two things together, you have a deadly combination. By themselves, they're okay. Mankind would be okay surviving based on these survival techniques. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil would be fine by itself, just sitting off to the side, having that knowledge just kind of inherent within it. When you mix those two things together, you get something very, there's a lot of conflict that comes from that. And so if you turn to Romans chapter 7, verses 22 and 23, we have the Apostle Paul really talking about this in a very dense way, in a very concise way. And I think it summarized everything that we've said so far. Again, this is Romans chapter 7, verses 22 and 23. Where he says, I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. So keep in mind that this is after the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We haven't got that far in our study yet, but just to let you know, eventually they are going to eat of this tree, and mankind is going to receive this knowledge of good and evil within them, in their inner man, in their thoughts. Intuitively, they're going to know between right and wrong. So this is what Paul's talking about in Romans 7:22. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. But I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin, which is in my members. You see, there is the conflict. According to the inner man, because we have this knowledge of good and evil, because we know the difference between right and wrong, we know what is good. And if someone were to ask us, is it wrong to just take something because it'll benefit you? We say, no, that's wrong. Or if you say it's wrong to just go up to someone and slap them or something like that, we say, no, that's wrong. Or, committing adultery, taking another person's spouse or anything like that, murder. We all know those things are wrong. And those are things that we know within us are wrong. We also know what's right. We know altruism is a good thing. Sacrificing ourselves for another person, that's a good thing. We all know that within us, but at the same time, we have this inward law, or this law of the members of our body working against what we know to be right and wrong. And so when we think about this in the context of this law, or this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we see that survival is really based on me. If you want to survive in this world, you got to look out for number one. That's the way we would say it. If I want to survive, let's face it, that's the best course to take. If my only purpose in life is to survive, to extend the years of my life, I'll look out for myself. I'll be more engaged in self-preservation, in gratifying myself, promoting myself over others so that I can get an edge on everybody else. If I'm just looking out for myself, that's a good way to survive. The problem is that the knowledge of good and evil isn't about me. God's law isn't about me, it's about the other person. Survival is me focused, morals is other focused, right? What did Jesus say was the summation of the whole law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So, in order for me to follow God's moral law, I can't think of myself anymore. I've got to look out for everybody else. I've got to first put God above myself. I got to love him with every fiber of my being. And two, I've got to love my neighbor in the same way that I would love myself. So whatever survival instincts I might have within myself, I've got to now project that onto the other person and care just as much for the other person as I would for myself. And so you can see where the conflict would arise between merely just surviving according to our animal instincts and following this moral code that man would take on if they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this conflict is always going on. In the law of our members, we want to just survive. But according to God's moral law, what does that call us to do a lot of times? Lay down our lives for others. What did Jesus say in John chapter 15? No greater love has a man than this. He lay down his life for his friends. And sometimes following God's moral law means I lay down my life for somebody else. And it might mean actually literally laying down my life for somebody else. Jumping in front of the train or, taking that bullet or whatever for somebody else. It might take literally giving my life for someone else. But it could also mean daily giving my life over to somebody else. It means constantly giving myself over for the benefit of another person. And so you can see where it's self-preservation, but then also loving other people more than yourselves, or putting them first above yourself, can be at conflict. We can see where self-gratification can be in conflict with love, where it's no longer just about me getting what I want, my own comfort, my own pleasure, what I want. Now I've got to be concerned about what the other person's needs are and be concerned about that. And so there's a conflict that erupts within us whenever we have a decision to make. Do I do what's better for that person, or do I do what will gratify myself? And that's that conflict Paul's talking about. Self-promotion, the law of the jungle, we might say, says, get an upper edge on everybody else. If you got to step on other people to get to the top, you do that. But God's law tells us sometimes we got to step down. It tells us that pride is a sin, that we have to humble ourselves. And if we humble ourselves, then God will exalt us. God gives grace to the humble, but he rejects and is resistant to those who are prideful. And so sometimes we got to step back and not try to step up over everybody else, but to let other people to have the glory and the attention, and sometimes the promotions in life, whatever those promotions might be. And so we can see where this conflict would arise. And now we can also see how God would forbid the man to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because God knows this conflict is going to arise. I built you for survival, that you would be blessed to be on this earth, that you could have dominion over the fish of the seas and all those things, the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all that. I built you for that. But if you take of this tree, now you're going to have this conflict. What makes this worse is not just the fact that you're going to have a conflict that, I want to do this, but I know I should do that. What's worse than that is now you're going to be accountable for what you do. Now you're going to be held accountable because now you know. And when you know, then you are accountable. Romans chapter 7, verse 8 says, without the law, sin is dead. Law gives power to sin. The more and more we know, and the more laws you have, the more and more you sin. You think about the laws of the land. The more and more laws they pass, and they seem to be passing them all the time. The more and more the laws pass, the more and more chances you have of breaking the law. And so without law, sin has no power. But because now that we have law, now that we do know between good and evil, now we are accountable for our actions. Animals don't have this. They have this self-preservation, self-gratification, self-promotion, this law of the members of their body, but they don't have a moral code. They didn't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so we can't say that a dog or a cat or a cow or something like that is morally wrong for doing what they do. Me and the dog at our house are not on speaking terms right now. The other day I got home, our little dog ate my Alfred Lord Tennyson book. He's a poet, he's a poet from the 19th century. But anyways, it's one of my favorite books. I love reading that book. And I got home one day and the cover was all torn up. She's a little small dog, still real young. And she chewed up the back cover of it, some of the pages. And I was not happy with that dog. But one thing I couldn't say about the dog, as much as I had plenty to say to the dog, I couldn't say that the dog was morally wrong for injuring my book. I couldn't go to the dog and say, that was such a selfish thing to do. You were just looking out for yourself. Don't you care how much that book meant to me? Of course I'm not going to say that to a dog. You don't speak about morals to dogs, right? And that would be true with anything that a dog does. One dog beats the other dog to the dish to eat. We don't say, no, that's morally wrong. You violated God's law. We don't do that. Because animals act like animals, and they're not moral agents like we are. They haven't eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They can't sit back and reflect on, I shouldn't have done that, or I ought to do this. They don't have that type of reasoning within them. And so they're not held accountable for their actions. And this is why God could use animals for sacrifices, because they're innocent. He can use animal sacrifices to atone for man's sin. And it worked up to a certain point, of course. as the book of Hebrews talks about, but it worked at least for a certain amount of time because they're innocent. They don't have a moral law, therefore they don't sin, and therefore they can atone for man's sin being an innocent sacrifice. But nonetheless, animals aren't held accountable, but we are now. We know right from wrong. We can't make an excuse. We can't say, yeah, I stole from that person, but I didn't know that was wrong. I didn't know it's wrong to steal. We all know deep down within ourselves that that's wrong. We know these things are wrong. If you look around across all the different nations, different people groups and things like that, these are all things that everyone understands. And the only ones that would conflict with that were the ones that perhaps taught people not to believe that way, right? We could think of some examples like that where there's been brainwashing and things like that. But generally speaking, everyone knows that these things are wrong or right, depending on what we're talking about, and they know. And so they're held accountable for their actions. So what do we do? Because we know in chapter 3 that they do eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and each of us feel that today. We know they ate of the tree, even if we didn't read Genesis chapter 3, we know because we know right from wrong. We're different from all other animals, right? So what do we do about it? Now that we've already crossed that threshold, how do we remedy this whole situation? Well, for a long time, people just tried to wrestle with right and wrong. They tried to do what was right. God dealt with them. God would give punishment, judgments against them. God would do all sort of things to try to work with them. But in the end, after all was said and done, something drastic had to happen to help us with this situation. And of course, it was Jesus Christ. Of course, we could talk about animal sacrifices, on through there. God did certain things, but the only ultimate way to deal with this problem was through Jesus Christ. And through Jesus Christ, then, we can have the knowledge of good and evil still. We can know between right and wrong, but at the same time have forgiveness when we don't follow what we know to be right and wrong. We have now Jesus offering himself up on the cross, shedding his blood for the forgiveness of sins. And so in our position before God, we can be justified before him, not on the basis of the fact that every single time in my life when I knew between right and wrong, I made the right choice, but based upon a sacrifice that Jesus Christ gave, a perfect sacrifice that said, yes, Joey, sometimes you did mess up along the way, but that's been covered under the blood of Christ. And so in that way, God has now taken us out of a state of death and separation, but brought us back to himself through Jesus Christ. So that's talking about it positionally, but even practically, God has given us a way to live a holy life, to live according to a different way. And this is found in Romans chapter 8, where now the Lord has given us of his Holy Spirit that can help us in overcoming these innate desires of the flesh. He says in verse 12 of Romans 8, so then, brethren, we are under obligation, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you are living according to the flesh, you must die. In other words, if you're just living according to survival, and you're just looking out for self, you're being selfish, self-preservation, gratification, promotion, as we talked about, then you're going to be put to death because you're going to be moving further and further away from the life of God. However, he goes on to say, but, the middle part of verse 13, but if by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. So now we have another part of us or aspect of our lives. We have this new law, we could say. He calls it the law of the Spirit of life in verse 2. We have this new law introduced. Before we had the law of our members, of our bodies, right, within us. But we knew that that wasn't right, even though we would still embark on that. But now the Lord has given us the Holy Spirit, another one in whom we can set our minds on and put to death those deeds of the body. So that so long as we set our minds on the Spirit, we rise above just living this earthly, fleshly, animalistic type of lifestyle. But we look up to the heavens and we set our minds on Christ. We set our minds on the Spirit, on things of the Spirit. We have our minds saturated with God's Word. We're praying to God. We're devoting our lives to God. We're worshiping God all day long, as we sung earlier. we're just always continually keeping our mindset on God. And to the point that we do that, we rise above this animalistic, just living according to the desires of the body. And we're able to put to death the deeds of the body and live a life that is pleasing to God. And so God has made provision for us to be positionally righteous before him, but also practically righteous before him as well, as we set our minds on the Spirit. And so these are some things that can help us to overcome these things. And so that is our lesson this morning, or this afternoon. The next section is kind of long, so I don't want to get into that. Next week, Lord willing, we'll be looking at the creation of woman, which is a really kind of a big deal. And we'll be looking at how that plays into Christ and the church, and we'll be looking at the spiritual significance of it. Ephesians chapter 5 tells us that there's more to it than just a woman being created. And there's some things inherent within the text that tend us to that. But that's going to be kind of a lengthy study, so I don't want to dive off into that this afternoon. So what do we walk away with? We say, you know what? I know within me I have several survival tendencies within me that makes me focus on self all the time. But I also have within me the knowledge that that doesn't always please God. It's not that 100% of the time it's wrong to look out for yourself. It's perfectly okay to do that in certain circumstances. But at the same time, God has given us boundaries. So moral law gives us boundaries around that. And sometimes we go outside those boundaries. And so we want to give our lives over to the Lord and continually be submitting to him, confessing our sins, letting him know when we've gone outside those boundaries, or letting him know that we've gone outside the boundaries, and bring those before him and find forgiveness. But at the same time, setting our minds on the things above, not the things on the earth, so that we can rise above just living a fleshly survival mentality and live a life pleasing to God. So that basically concludes our study today. And I don't think that there's any